I'm Andy Boze, a systems librarian at the Hesburgh Libraries, University of Notre Dame. I've worked with HTML nearly 30 years since I built the library's first website in 1993. I didn't learn CSS until nearly 10 years later, primarily out of personal interest because I wasn't involved in the website development at that point. In that time, I hadn't investigated the tools that one might use in web development other than HTML editors and occasionally just pressing Control-U to view the code behind web pages. It wasn't until 2013 that I became involved with supporting Koha. Notre Dame has international programs worldwide, and 3 so-called gateway programs in London, Rome, and Jerusalem have libraries. Because these gateway libraries were at Notre Dame international campuses and hosting Notre Dame students, faculty, and staff, we wanted our library websites, including Koha, to look much like other sites that people were used to using. So it was this support of Koha that led me to discover tools that I could use to do the customization. Next slide. In this presentation, I'll talk about Koha template files on the server that we've modified to customize the OPAC and the software I use to access and edit the files. I'll talk about browser-based tools, including Firefox, but these or similar tools are available for other browsers, such as the built-in web developer tools and an add-on called Stylus. I'll describe how we use Google Drive to store and serve our external CSS files. I'll start by briefly talking about how you can add your own HTML to predefined areas of the OPAC pages and how to edit template files. Next slide. So let's look at the Unstyled, and by that I mean the default Koha style main OPAC page. Of the 6 areas I've highlighted, 5 of them were accomplished by adding HTML through the staff client. The word book bag at the top was not added this way. The 3 were added via the news tool. The sidebar at left was added by the OPAC nav setting. Quote of the day was added using the quote editor tool and enabling quote of the day system preference. There are several other preferences you can use to add your own text. You can find information about them and other theming information at the online Koha theming guide, and I have references for that in the notes at the end of these slides. Next slide. There were 2 textual changes that we needed to make in the OPAC that couldn't be done by using settings in the staff client. One was the change of the word cart to book bag. The other was to modify the login box. This required us to look through the files in the includes and modules directories for the text strings to find the correct files to edit. Fortunately, it was fairly easy to guess the files by their names. Next slide. I use a program called WinSCP to connect to the server and access the file system. Before editing a file, I make a backup copy of it in case I make an error so that I can easily restore it if necessary. Right-clicking on the file's name opens a context menu. So I can select edit from the menu and the file is downloaded to my local computer and opened in a text editor. Next slide. So I use the search feature of my text editor to search for the text string and then make changes. You need to be careful to change only text, usually within quotation marks or between HTML tags and not actual template code. After you've made your edits, you save the file and WinSCP uploads it to the server. I find this easier than using a terminal emulator and working from the Unix command line to edit files. Next slide. After a file has been edited and saved, you can load the relevant page in Koha to see whether the change had the expected result. You don't have to restart the server. I'll emphasize that it's a good idea to make a backup copy of any file before you edit it. In case you make a mistake, you can restore the backup file while you try to figure out what went wrong. Next slide. Okay. After you've added any HTML or made any template edits, you can begin using CSS to style the user interface. A note here, if you add HTML and want to style it, it can be helpful to add or class or ID attributes to the tags to identify them, making it easier to apply your CSS. Next slide. I'll show you some of the styles that we've applied to Koha. Here we have the unstyled and styled main OPAC page. If you notice a difference in the quote of the day text, that's because those screenshots were taken on 2 separate days, so the quote actually changed. Next slide. Here's the unstyled and styled login form. Notre Dame uses Shibboleth for our authentication. Since we have only a couple of local users, we didn't want to confuse our Notre Dame users by showing the user and password fields, which they were inclined to fill in accidentally. So we hide them unless a user intentionally clicks on the local login. Something like this would often be accomplished using JavaScript, but we use CSS to do the showing and hiding. Next slide. And here we have the unstyled and styled self-checkout page. Next slide. Okay. There are 2 ways to apply CSS to Koha. In the system preferences, you'll find a preference where you can add a URL or a file name for a style sheet file. That's the OPAC additional style sheet preference. Or the other preference, OPAC user CSS, where you can enter the CSS directly. You can use either or both. I'm focusing on the OPAC, but there are similar preferences for the staff user interface. And you can see a little bit of that at the bottom of that screen capture. Next slide. I use Firefox's developer tools and an add-on called Stylus to develop CSS. Let's start with the developer tools to inspect the HTML of Koha's main page. The three sections of the tool shown here are the page's HTML on the left, the CSS that applies to the various HTML elements in the middle, and the element layout on the right. Next slide. In particular, we'll look at the quote of the day section as an example. Here you can see the unstyled text and then the styled text after we apply our CSS to it. Next slide. So from Firefox, you press Control-Shift-I to open Developer Tools. Use the Element Picker tool, which I've highlighted in the upper left-hand corner, or circled in red, to select the element from the page that you want. I've selected the quote section. Within the tool, any HTML tag I hover over is highlighted in the web page. And if I click on an HTML element, the style and layout are shown at right. We'll focus on the style here. I've selected a div element with the ID daily quote. The tool highlights the section of the page rendered by the HTML and shows me any CSS that applies to the element. The element contains additional elements that I want to style, having the IDs daily quote text, daily quote sep, and daily quote source. Next slide. If you recall the styled quote of the day text that you saw on a previous slide, you'll remember that it has a pair of quotation marks around it. Those were added as background images by means of a data URL in the CSS. That's what those long, ugly lines are in the daily quote text rule. So by adding or modifying the CSS within the tool, I can see how it will style the web page. Unfortunately, if I reload the page, I lose the CSS. This is where I use Stylus to store my CSS in the browser so that it gets applied to the site every time I visit it. Next slide. As I create CSS using the developer tool and I'm satisfied with it, I copy the CSS to Stylus and save it. It should be obvious that the CSS that I save in Stylus appears only in Firefox for me and for no one else who visits the site. Next slide. I have two options then, either to save the CSS in the OPAC user CSS preference or to create a file and use the OPAC additional style sheet to point to it. If I'm in the process of developing the CSS, I'll sometimes use OPAC user CSS, but for my completed CSS, I use a file in Google Drive. Either way works fine, and it's largely just a matter of what's the most convenient for you. We chose to use Google Drive because it's our institutional cloud storage, so everyone has easy access to it. If we stored the file on the Koha server or elsewhere, it would be necessary for us to set up and manage accounts. Furthermore, Google Drive allows us to have a rudimentary version control system that we wouldn't have if we stored the CSS in the OPAC user CSS preference. I'll explain how we use Google Drive. Next slide. We set up a shared drive with permissions for appropriate staff to be able to edit the CSS files. CSS files, being plain text files, are not a native format for Google Drive. So the easiest thing to do is create the file on your local hard drive, then copy it to Google Drive. It's important to use the file extension CSS so that Google Drive understands that it's a style sheet file and not some other type of text file. Otherwise, Google Drive will serve it with the wrong MIME type. Be aware that renaming a file to have a CSS extension will not change the MIME type. So if you start out with a .txt file and change it to CSS, that still won't change the MIME type. It must be created with the CSS extension. The file must also be shared to the internet, otherwise Koha will not be able to access it. Next slide. I typically use Chrome. There we go. I typically use Chrome when I work with Google products, and there's a nice extension for a text and code editor called, not surprisingly, Text Editor. It appears to work with any web browser just by going to the website, the URL for which is in the notes at the end of the slides. If you use it as a browser extension, it will add itself to the Google Drive context menu. Next slide. Since we have an enterprise subscription, most often I use Google Drive for desktop. This is a program that you can install on your own computer, and then this maps Google Drive to your local file system. There are versions for Windows and Mac OS. I don't think there's one for Linux. This method lets me open and edit a file in any desktop application I want. Here I've opened the CSS file in a program called Notepad++. Next slide. If you decide to serve your CSS files from Google Drive, there are some things to be aware of. First, Koha cannot use the URL that Google Drive gives you when you copy the link. You have to alter it. The first URL is what Google Drive gives you when you copy it, but Koha can't read it in that form. Koha can only read it correctly if it's converted into the second format. You can actually see the difference in the two URLs if you open them in a web browser. The first one will open in a viewer frame. The second will be treated as a plain text file served with a MIME type of style sheet. And your browser will probably want to download it if you open the file directly in your browser. The second thing, as noted earlier, the file must be shared to the internet. Next slide. So here's the software that I mentioned in this presentation. I didn't mention Firefox, of course, but these are the programs that I use. So WinSCP to edit the file system on the server, Stylus to work with developing CSS, Google Drive for desktop, and a couple of text editors. Next slide. And finally, here's some notes for resources that would likely be of some use in styling or theming your instance of Koha. Next slide. So at this point, I'll take any questions, and if we can get the screen sharing working, I can give you some actual live demos of some of what I've talked about at this point.
Okay, George is back, so he did make you co-host, so you should be able to share your screen now. So
oh, great, great.
You want to do that, go for it. I didn't see, I covered it up. The only comment so far in the YouTube chat is that you got props for your quote styling. David Nid really likes how you style your quotes. And I just wanted to comment that a lot of us are vendor supported, so we don't have access to that sort of back end stuff that you were showing us. So if that looked a little weird to people, that's stuff that Bywater does for a lot of people.
Yeah, and actually that was something I wanted to mention too, is that if you're vendor supported, then you can do all of this stuff with the exception of the actual accessing the file system.
Right.
And
we can't change the templates per se, but we can use like jQuery. Like when you were switching the book bag terminology, we can use jQuery to grab that and change out the term there. So we have access to that kind of from a different angle. But it's interesting to see kind of the back end of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. If you don't have to edit the templates yourself, it's kind of a good thing. It was a little daunting at first, just trying to figure out which was the right template file to edit, and then as I cautioned, it's a good idea to make backups, because if you don't and screw something up, you're kind of you're kind of dead.
Yeah, and the other benefit of using the system preferences like intranet user JS and intranet user CSS is those aren't like when you upgrade, all that chunk is right there. So like if something breaks, you can just piece it in and out and figure out what's broken and that sort of thing. You don't have to dig into the file system as much. So it makes upgrades a little smoother as well.
Yeah, that's true. Let's see if I can share the screen here. I will.
Oh, we do have some stuff coming through on the YouTube chat. It is a little slow, as I mentioned. David also mentioned that some of your tools are very useful. Stylus, he likes Stylus a lot. Someone is asking if you can talk about how to convert the link to a usable one. So I'm assuming they're talking about that Google link. Google Drive.
Yeah. Let's see. All right. Oh, let's see. Try to figure out what's the right thing to share here. I guess this. All right. So can you all see my my screen?
Yes, I see London Global Gateway Library right now.
Okay. So you said someone asked about the Let me get to that slide. Yeah, there we go. I won't send this to full presentation mode. Otherwise, we'll get my voiceover. So if you can see this, what you the URL that when you copy it directly out of Google Drive, this first one is the URL that you get. So the important part of that is this the part right here that I've bolded. And if you just take that part of it and stick it at the end of this URL and the second one, then Google will serve that up as just a plain text file, or in this case, it'll be a plain text file with the file type or MIME type of style sheet. So I can actually show you what happens. Let's see if I can copy that. And oops. So this is what happens if you just load the file in your browser that that you copy directly from Google Drive. There we go. So you can see it opens it up in a viewer. If we look at the if we look at the code for that, which is what Koha would see when it tries to read it, it just wouldn't make any sense to Koha at all. So using this second URL, it treats it as a text file. In this case, it either wants to open it or download it. I'll open it in my text editor. And this is what Koha would see, just a plain text file. So that's basically what you have to do in order to serve a CSS file out of Google Drive. You can serve a file, CSS file, off of any file server you happen to have. You just need to make sure that it's served with the correct file type.
And George asked, George wasn't here. So I think, Andy, you mentioned you were using Google because that's your institutional, where your institutional stuff is. He asked if you'd considered ever using GitHub or GitLab, which like other good alternatives for the same thing.
Yeah, we've actually talked about that, and I suspect one of these days we'll probably move our files over. When we started doing this some years ago, we were just really starting to use GitHub, and in fact, we were using some other repository at that point. I don't remember what, but we were only just starting to use it at that time. And now we're pretty heavily on GitHub, and we have a lot of things that we are serving out of GitHub. So I wouldn't be surprised if probably within the next couple of years that we do move this stuff over, because the version control is better, and we really only have a couple of people at this point working on the CSS files. So and they would already have accounts on GitHub. So there's no big advantage for us at this point of staying with using Google Drive. But for people who don't have GitHub, Google Drive is a convenient way to do it if you want to store your files separately from Koha. Let's see. Were there any other questions?
Just a couple additional comments from George. He said he was wondering because he did hear the version control comment, which is good.
Yeah, and that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize that Google Drive can do is version control. It will keep your versions of files automatically up, I think for 30 days. And beyond that, like if there was if I'd made some edits and I knew that I wanted them to be permanent, I can just tell Google Drive, make this a permanent archived copy of it, and it'll just keep it forever until I want to restore it if I need to. Okay, so I'll give you some examples of let's see. I'll go here. So, all right. I'll just give you a quick example of how I go about developing styles for Koha. So I'll start out just with this is how our page looks unstyled, or basically out of the box in Koha. So to start off with, I would press Shift Control I. You can get to it through the menu as well. And then if there's a particular part of the page that I'm interested in, I just use the element picker tool here. Just click on that. And then when I hover over the page, it highlights the various parts of the HTML. So if I go to quote of the day, there we go. So that should be the whole quote of the day section of the HTML. If I go back here to the developer tool, you can see that it has selected that section in the HTML. Sometimes I have to look around a little bit. Sometimes I find that it might select something internal to the section that I'm really looking for. So I just make sure that it has selected the complete element that I want. And then you can see one of the nice things is that as I hover over the different HTML elements, it actually shows me in the page exactly what they are. So just as a real simple example, with the daily quote, let's say that, oh, and this is the default style that just comes with Koha. So if I want to leave it that margin bottom as is, I can leave that. And then just by clicking in there, oops. There we go. Let's say that I want to make the text red. I just type in my CSS, and you can see that immediately it has changed the color of my text to red. So anything that that you enter here will you'll see the effect of it immediately. Let's see if I want to copy that CSS. Let's say the whole section of CSS for the daily quote. I can just right click on it and say copy rule. So that's now copied, and I can paste it wherever I want. So I can paste it into my text editor. Or what I often do is, actually, as I'm satisfied with these, I'll copy them into my text editor just to have a place to hold them. And then let's close this and go to Stylus. And I can, if I don't already have a style for it, I can write a style for this host or the domain or the particular URL. I'll do it for the host name. And then whatever HTML I have saved, I'll just paste that right into Stylus. And now let's save that. Now, if I reload the page, if I hadn't put it in Stylus, but just left it in the developer tool, when I reload the page, I would have lost that. But now, since it's in Stylus, you can see that the little icon for Stylus up here shows that I've got one active rule, and that's turning the quote of the day text red.
So just for my own clarification, because I haven't used Stylus, this is just creating like a local style sheet that kind of stays just within your browser, right?
Yeah, it's entirely local. It's just in Firefox. So this is a convenient way for me as I'm developing the styles. I can put the the CSS together, even just an element at a time. And then once I have it compiled in the Stylus, once I've got the all of the CSS compiled, or at least as much as I want, then from there, I'll just copy it and let's see. I'll open up another here and go to let's see. I want to make sure not to do anything with our production server. Yeah. Let's see. Here we go. We've got two-factor authentication, so there we go. So if I want to make that CSS more permanent, one way to do it is just to go into Koha administration, look for the global system preferences. An easy way to get to the CSS is just search for CSS. And then for our OPAC preferences, if I've already built the style sheet file and have it in Google Drive or wherever, I can put the URL here. Otherwise, I can use the OPAC user CSS. Open that up. For this demo, the reason that you see this URL here is because originally it was up here in the additional style sheet field, but just to hold on to it, I put it in the OPAC user CSS and commented it out. So if I take that CSS and just copy it in there and save it. And if I go back to here, I can turn all the styles off and reload the page. And now it's taking the CSS from the OPAC user CSS preference and styling it that way. So I hope that kind of gives you an idea of how you might use these tools, the developer tools and Stylus, to build your own CSS.
Yeah, I hadn't ever heard of Stylus, but I'm excited. I'm definitely going to be using that.
It's really handy. I've been there was a prior version of it. It was forked from a program called Stylus, which had some when it was sold by its initial developer to a big bad company. There were some privacy issues involved with it. So a lot of people who were using Stylus switched to using Stylus, which was also forked at that time for that reason.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
We're rounding out the hour. We did get started a little late, so if there's anything else you want to add, I think you've got a few minutes to play with that. I don't see any additional comments in the YouTube chat, but if you all have questions, feel free to get those poked in there now. And it will take the stream's a little laggy, so we'll give it a couple seconds for those to catch up. Go ahead.
I'll show you just a couple of other things that we did. Aside from the styling of the page, and I showed this in the slide. We didn't particularly like the way that the login form worked. So this was one thing where not only did we have to develop the CSS for it, but this is one of the things that we also had to change some code in the template files. So it was a little more complicated than just changing the word book bag in the template files. We actually had to add a little bit of HTML directly to a template file in order to be able to apply the CSS in the way that we wanted. But I was kind of pleased with myself for being able to figure out how to kind of do this, you know, show and hide the login without using JavaScript. And let's see, then, oh, the other thing that we did, oops, was I'm already logged in here. And this is the same thing that we did. We had to modify a template file a little bit in order to be able to apply the CSS the way that we wanted. And actually, we in the template we added this text because there wasn't a way in the system preferences to be able to add the text there. So
I'm seeing a lot of thank yous in the chat. George just said he just finished adding Stylus to his own Firefox. So you've inspired several of us for sure.
Oh, that's great.
And I'll just say I really enjoy these kinds of presentations just to see what other people are doing to harvest ideas. That's my word, harvest. So I like to see kind of what you're doing and ways that we can implement it here for my own personal use. And I think other people enjoy that too. So
Oh, good.